So moving on to the third part of this sixth lecture series, thinking about how you analyze focus group and interview data and some of the pitfalls you might encounter in trying to make inferences on the basis of the evidence you collect using either interviews or focus groups. One thing, again, to think about is that these are, we can, to some extent, think about extending some of what we talked about in the survey research week, that these are not true attitudes or true feelings, and probably, in fact, the impact of the social interaction itself is far greater even in a more one-on-one and particularly in a more anonymous survey setting. So it doesn't mean that people are lying so much as they're very much responding to their social environment. Self-reporting what they think or feel will be very affected by sort of their desire to maintain some sort of a social dynamic within the group itself. So there'll be a lot of self-impression management goals going on. One of the things that I haven't seen very often but could imagine would be useful if one really thought there was a good time to think about using focus group type methods or other things where you wanted to capture the dynamic of group conversation might be to actually measure some of these individual impression management goals outside that. So how comfortable are you with conflict, et cetera? Because you might then be able to understand more where people are coming from, and you can start to see some of these deliberative moves do people try to sort of, when there's a little bit of conflict, rush in and sort of fix it. What kind of language are they using? So there could be a nice match with that once you understand what people are doing. So again, though, these sort of controlled impression management motives are going to be true in general of all talk and not just focus groups and interviews and surveys. So even if you go and you, for example, look at comments on a blog post, or you look at a news group or something like that, even if you observe conversation in a naturalistic setting, again, all of these we need to think about how we interpret what people say, keeping in mind that it's not that people are either lying or telling the truth. They are shaping and saying what they say, being aware of their social context. And of course, the hardest thing here is that once you have the text, in essence, you still haven't really gone in and measured what it is you're interested in. So typically what you need to then go in is do something with your data, whether it be a more quantitative approach to count the number of times certain words were used, or maybe you're going to do more qualitative, looking for sort of key phrases and concepts. There are, even within the qualitative and quantitative camps for text analysis, there's a broad range of approaches. You can have things like grounded theory, where you're doing pure theory building, or other types of things. So what's interesting is that you can, in fact, nonetheless do at least some versions of qualitative content analysis, more automated. So you have this thing, we have some techniques called supervised learning, where you might have somebody go through and code, say, the first, 5% or so of an interview or of a focus group qualitatively, and then have the computer try to learn the coding scheme that's being used. We'll come back and talk a little bit about coding schemes in the next lecture part. Another thing that you can do, is particularly with filmed groups, is do gesture analysis, which has been, we don't talk about it a lot in political science, but it's been used extensively in social psychology and other areas of psychology, for example, to understand that the way people talk and what they think is often reflected in how these nonverbal cues. So they've been able to show that even before children can sometimes explicitly add and say the answer of 2 + 2, if you watch their hands, they sort of know that the answer is 4, but they don't quite yet know how to put it into words. So again, this gesture analysis can be quite revealing of implicit or sort of automated responses that are sometimes slightly outside conscious awareness or even verbal awareness. There's also some process analysis coding or discussion dynamics. So you can, for example, look at things like how often people interrupt each other, or if people are talking, do people address their comment back to the person who asked them a question, or do they sort of turn their attention back to somebody else? If somebody says, well, Mary just said this, does that person then just say, well, Joe, I didn't actually just sort of say that. Does Mary respond, or does somebody else sort of claim that turn? And another thing that you can do by looking across multiple and keeping in mind not just the text itself, but also who said it, is you can start to do things like looking at identifying sort of what knowledge and values and language are shared as opposed to which ones aren't, particularly in more contentious settings. Now, one thing to keep in mind, super important, is that the interviewer themselves or the facilitator can be an important source of bias. So think about this as like, if you can imagine that when we talked about what happens whenever it's no longer a double-blind experiment in the experiments week, it's much, much worse, right? In the case where you have these lengthy, drawn-out discussions, particularly if the interviewer has some desire that they want to lead people in a certain place. And often people will be looking to the interviewer for cues about what they're supposed to say or not say. So you can imagine that in a marketing study, people might want to be like, yeah, this is great. Instead of be like, no, this is a terrible marketing study, or this is a terrible product. What are the other types of sources of bias you can have? Well, the interviewer can stereotype, or the interviewer can stereotype the person, but also, in essence, the interviewer themselves can be stereotyped, right? So when we think about race of interviewer effects, this could be that people say what they think that they want their interviewer to hear. People can also, in essence, sort of form a first impression and then keep, it's very, very similar. Negative impressions can lead the, if a interviewer has a negative impression of a person that's subject, they can end up more quiet and less likely to talk because they might sort of be aware that there's some sort of negativity that's being directed towards them. There's a lot of nonverbal bias. They can end up with leading questions where they say, well, you know, could you tell us this? And so again, you can imagine that in some cases, leading questions or sort of a question, whenever you notice that somebody is disagreeing but isn't saying it, can be useful in bringing out difference. But if it seems like sort of like a teacher fishing for an answer where you know what answer they want you to give and you just haven't given it to them yet, it could end up leading the conversation in the wrong ways. And people, in essence, this is a form of expectancy or expectation bias. And finally, there can be very, very different backgrounds that people come from that can be a big problem. And there's all sorts of ways, right, that these the interviews themselves can be quite biased. Now, one of the issues here, and this is similar for facilitator training, interviewer training, is the idea is supposed to be that you need to exercise reflexivity as an interviewer. So in essence, you need to be aware of your own biases. Take this into account into your sort of research design. And even in some cases, actually stated as part of your study. So some people are very aware of the idea that you don't need to actually try to necessarily monitor what you're doing at the time, but what you need to do is state your biases sort of in your study itself, and think about how these impact on the collection analysis of data. I think another approach that is more along the lines of at least the way I was trained facilitation, that I haven't seen a lot of it in the formal literature, would be to, in essence, try to constantly monitor yourself, to try to keep yourself as neutral as possible, which can be quite difficult. Or at the very least, keep yourself in the position you want to be to elicit what you think is the best type of data given your design and research. So it's very similar in that you need to be aware of the way you yourself can impact. We used to call it 3 tracking. So sort of you're paying attention to what the goals of your study are, how the other person is feeling about what is happening in the room, and also your own biases and your own reactions so that you can sort of manage them without impinging upon. You have to manage the second two in order to deal with the first one, which is the goals of the study. But again, even in those cases where you're 3 tracking instead of being reflexive or only sort of reflexive, you want to think a lot about how the other person was feeling and how what you were doing might have been making them feel, or other reasons they might be feeling those ways or thinking those ways would impact the collection analyses of data. So how much was the fact that a criminal was talking to you, were they trying to present themselves in a certain light? Were they trying to be tougher, or were they trying to be less tough, right? Like you have to think about what your general impressions are of how that works. In general, the more you can be reflexive, basically your measurement and the reliability of your measures should be improving. There's been several books that can be useful in this case that are looking up, including there's some classes even here at UMass that can be quite useful in that. Ethnography, for example, in the political science department. So, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages overall of the interview and focus group techniques? Obviously, you get more in-depth response, less constrained by predefined options. You can get much more flexible, identifying emergent themes, again, especially with grounded theory. And you can be adjusting to the sort of interviewee's style. So often I find the way I have to ask questions might depend on who it is that I'm interviewing. And you can figure out which style sort of people relaxes people a bit more, gets them to open up a bit more and talk more freely about some of the topics you're interested in. You also can have much greater insight into things like nonverbal cues, gestures, pauses. Again, where attention gets directed, the way people respond, would they answer your question directly, or do they not answer it directly, right? So you can see, in essence, you can read, you can use techniques to read into these things. Like if people are afraid of answering your question, it means there's something about it, right, that's making them nervous. And you can sometimes, if they pause for a long time, you can tell they're really working hard to figure out how to answer you while they sort of manage their impression, right? It's going to tend to indicate a more controlled response. You also have the ability to probe and follow up and clarify answers. The disadvantages, of course, are that it's incredibly costly and very impractical with large numbers of respondents. You can't always make the same types of inferences that you can with other things, so you can't sort of extrapolate out and generalize all the time, particularly because of the issues of sampling. There are clearly potential for significant biases, and the only way you can really start to sort of try to eliminate this is fairly extensive training, which is often not that available. And finally, there's always the issue of the responses themselves still need to be basically analyzed or coded in some way in order to make sense of them and turn them into more tractable data set.